go. All right. Welcome. This is the Aquarium Insider Podcast with your host. My name is Dan Connor. And today, super excited. I've got Bentley Pascoe here. We're going to be talking about planting tanks for beginners. So, Bentley, thank you, man. I appreciate you coming and do this today.
Dude, happy to be here.
Awesome, man. Well, we get a lot of questions here, either through our social media or in our store here, and they keep asking, like, hey, I want to do plants. What's a good way to do plants? What's a good place to start? And I'm like, man, this is going to be a good video to do all about, beginner tanks, beginner planted tanks, which I think is pretty cool. Yeah. So, Bentley, could you just kind of introduce yourself real quick, tell everybody what you do, what you keep, and give them a little bit of your background?
Yeah. So I've kept fish since I was a child. So aka my parents kept fish and I just enjoyed them up until I was in my teens and my early college years. I eventually dropped out of the hobby and then kind of came back a little over 5 years ago now. And ever since then, like, I had never had a planted tank when I was a kid. We had never tried any plants other than like one banana plant once, and our fish absolutely demolished it. And I got inspired through YouTube. It was at a time where I had one of my previous jobs coming to an end, and I was trying to just find something to relieve a little of the stress of knowing, like, I'm going to have to go back in the job market and go hunting. And I came across a video on YouTube from a channel called The Green Machine. And it was like, I remember having fish. I need fish again. And like 2 days later, I'd watched every video on their channel. I'd found a bunch of other channels, and it was like, okay, I was in research mode. I was getting ready. And now, I've eventually evolved myself into kind of a rainbow fish specialist. So I keep almost primarily rainbow fish. There's a few other things I keep. I've got a specific line of guppy called the Blue Hawaiian Moscow. That's like my baby that I spent forever trying to find. And then that's its own crazy story. But, between those two, that's kind of what I focus on. And then I absolutely adore planted tanks. I didn't think I was going to love them as much as I do. And my first couple tanks, including this tank behind me, were absolute failures. They went everything you could possibly do wrong, I did wrong, and I just learned through failure. And slowly but surely, I'm a super tenacious, persistent person. So when I screw something up, I always take it as an opportunity to learn, and that's one of my biggest pieces of advice to anybody who is starting with plants or is having trouble with plants: is don't be afraid to fail, because that's what I did. I failed a lot. And you can learn from those failures. It just takes a little bit of tenacity to push through them and realize that, like, hey, it's not your fault. You're still learning. You can't expect to know everything immediately. You're gonna have some bumps in the road. You're gonna have some troubles, and eventually you're gonna get to a point you'll be like a psychopath like me, where you're like, oh yeah, my local club has a plant program. It takes like 6 months to a year to get the Master Aquatic Horticulturist Award. Depends on how like insane you are about it. And it's like, now I'm almost on my 10th one.
Wow.
So
awesome.
It's one of those things where you'll find your rhythm and you find your beat, and you just kind of start going crazy and enjoying it. And now pretty much it's unheard of for me to have a tank without plants in it, because I love the way they look. I love all the benefits they give for my fish, for aesthetic purposes. For everything, it's just one of those things where it's changed how I view any given aquarium. Where if I see an aquarium without plants, it's like, that better be a breeding tank.
No,
it's like the way that my brain is. It's just like, if there are no plants, that better be only for breeding fish.
Got it.
I'm so far removed from that, like the days of when I was a kid, or even in high school, where it's like, yeah, that broken pirate ship ornament does look really cool in my tank. Now it's like, oh boy, it's one of those, and I'm sure that sounds super snobby, but that's where I am now. And so a lot of what I do through YouTube is try to help educate people on what I've learned and where I've had my pitfalls, so that they don't necessarily have to deal with them.
Yeah, I mean, that's great. And I know you mentioned it, and I wanted to, I'll kind of ask this because I always do, but your biggest piece of advice to avoid? I know you mentioned failures. What's the process look like? Okay, I failed at this. I mean, what does it look like to move forward from that and not, get just burn out, I guess, from the failure? Because it happened. I mean, it happens. It happened a lot to me, even being on the farm and stuff. We all constantly have failures. That's just all it is. So what's that process look like to deal with it and kind of move forward?
Yeah, well, so nowadays it's kind of evolved. At first, it was one of those things where it was like, well, identify how the plant died. Did it die from the bottom up? Did the leaves wilt back and in first, but the stem still felt like it was pretty solid?
Yeah.
And it was learning, like, I think the biggest lesson I learned is that early on, at least, when I was really getting into this, it's like, almost every plant I was buying was not meant to be fully submerged at first. They were grown immersed.
Yeah.
So all that foliage is probably going to die.
Yeah.
The plant has to go through this process of converting itself. And there's like little tricks that you eventually learn to speed that process up or to make that process more reliable.
Yeah.
So that you don't lose as many plants. And sometimes you can't help, especially if you're shipping plants to yourself, right? Yeah. Depending on weather or depending on the shipper, you're not going to be able to help it because either that plant got too hot, it got too cold, whatever it may be in the shipping process that's going to shock that plant so much that it's really, really hard to get it to recover. Now, thankfully, there's lots of really good shippers out there where you're not going to run into the temperature-related problems, but there's plenty of bigger names, just leave it like that, who don't care. And you will run into that. And I've dealt with it myself in the past. And so one of those things where you just kind of have to be able to take the time to realize, okay, how did the plant die? And then go research, use Google, find some of the old forums that have great information like planettank.net or the Bar Report. There's tons and tons of, chuckleheads like me on YouTube who talk about plants and do their best to try and help people. And YouTube is a fantastic resource as long as you realize that often you need to watch 3 or 4 different videos and find the one thing that everybody says the same. And that's probably the one part that is truthful. Yeah. And some of it is just personal experience that is going to change because your water is probably nothing like, Bentley's water or Dan's water or this person's water. And that's the next kind of evolution down my chain of understanding was like, no matter how many things I look up online, I have to inherently understand my water. Because the more that I understand my water, what comes out of my tap, what goes into my tank, how it's going to be, what, if any, I am doing to it, I'm going to understand fundamentally some of the ways that I need to change to make things more successful. So an example is like the Seattle area. If you're on city water, there's nothing in it. It comes out of the tap between 27 and about 32 TDS, depending in the year. It's like, think about that. That's total dissolved solids. Yeah. That's not even like a reasonable test. Yeah. Right. And your carbonate hardness out of the water is like 1 degree KH. There's like nothing. So it won't hold pH. Yeah. So you'll put it in your tank and 24 to 48 hours later, you go from this water that's a little basic. It sits at like 7.2 to 7.4, depending on the time of year. And 48 hours later, it's at 6.5, 6.3, 6.0 because it has no carbonate hardness. Yeah. There's nothing in there to hold your pH. So if you don't buffer it in some way, shape, or form, whether it's crushed coral or baking soda or however you choose, if you want to remineralize it that way, however you choose to hold those things, you have all sorts of potential issues if you're not paying attention to those things. So it's one of those things that I learned the hard way. I lost a ton of cardinal tetras. I lost all sorts of plants, and it was sitting there going like, why the hell is this happening? Over and over again. And thankfully I'm super persistent because I think most aquarists probably would have quit with what I dealt with this little tank behind me that now is like my almost joke algae farm, this poor flex that's been going for 5 years. But it's one of those things where most people probably would have gave up. And for me, I'm such a tenacious person that it was like, I have to find the answer because I'm such a fixer at heart. So if I can't fix the problem, it drives me up the walls. And I'll do everything I can to try and fix it. And so I just kept researching. One of the first things I learned is like, oh, there's nothing in my water. There's nothing. Jesus. And my pH, like just after testing, was like, okay, well, I'll go get a bare 10-gallon tank. The $10 per gallon sales going on. Get one, and I'll just put water in a tank and just have an air stone in there and find out what my water is like when I put it in. 24 hours later, 48 hours later, it was like, oh, it's like 7.2 pH. 48 hours later, it's 5.8. Shoo. Because it's just, there's nothing.
Yeah, there's nothing in there.
And it was like, oh, well, that's a big problem. That's probably why I'm losing fish.
Oh, definitely.
So it was like, okay, you start doing more research. It's like, okay, well, crushed coral is a great thing for us. Put some calcium in the water. It's going to help hold, going to help stabilize.
Yep.
There's a good start. And when it came to plants, one of the biggest mistakes I kept making is as soon as I started seeing too much stuff wilt and die while it was converting from being immersed grown, I would assume the plant was dead and would remove it. When really what I needed to do is observe how it was dying, which almost always is like from the stem up. You'll get some of the upper leafage will come off, but the top of the stem is typically okay. But if you see it dying from the stem up, all you have to do is go up basically a full node, cut, remove all that dead tissue. That, when you dig enough, it teaches you that triggers the plant to grow fresh roots because it thinks that it broke in a river system or it broke by a fish or something, and it's trying to find something to grab onto and reestablish itself. And those roots are converted to the new water system, and they'll do just fine, and the rest of that plant should convert and survive. And as soon as you start seeing new foliage up top, you know that you have the two. You have new foliage up top, and you have new roots underneath. That plant will be fine. You just have to be patient, give it light and fertilizer, and you'll be okay.
I like it.
And as soon as I learned that, it changed my whole landscape of plants.
Huh. That's going to be, I think that's the most important thing is, one, I'm sure everyone who's watching this or listening to this on, Spotify or whatever, your water is always going to be different. You better make sure and know where your water is going to be coming out of the tap. So you know where your source is going to be. So if you need to change things, you can, right? You need to be able to adapt to that based on what you want to do for it. And then, two, just the persistence of doing that is pretty awesome. Because that's probably the hardest. That's the most difficult thing I think I hear is it's frustrating when this dies or this happens, and they're just like, I don't know what happened. Like, well, you got to be more methodical in your approach, and not just say it died because XYZ. You got to figure out what happened and then make your adjustments, rather than just say, oh, it was this. It's got to be a little bit more, I guess, methodical, thought out, a little bit more plan in place, I guess. So
yeah,
I like
and just one of the things is, understand it's a horrible feeling, especially if you're like a big softie like me and you hate ever seeing an animal die or an animal be in pain. You don't want to be like, oh yeah, I'm just going to kill a bunch of fish when I start. No one wants that feeling. And some of the answer to that is like, well, especially if you want to do a planet tank, you don't have to put fish in it for quite a while. You can just take your time, figure out the plant side of stuff, get that established. And then once you've got an established planet tank, you probably have a system that's really, really healthy to introduce fish into.
Yeah.
And at that point, you've got all you get away from the science part of like understanding a cycle. If you take enough time to get a planet tank truly established, you've gone through every part of the cycle.
Yeah.
You don't have to worry about, is my tank cycled anymore? It's cycled. There's bacteria, there's living stuff, there's the plants. They're naturally going to help deal with some of that filtration on their own. It's not just reliant on that hang on the back power filter or that canister or whatever the heck you're using. You've established an ecosystem that will only really do better by adding some fish and some fish waste, because now it just provides that little bit of respirated CO2. It provides that little bit of extra waste chemicals that those plants are going to go like, oh, that's just food. We like food. Food is delicious, and it's for the fish. They're already going into an environment where they have natural places to hide. They're less likely to deal with as much stress. You have things that you don't realize, like biofilms and microfauna that they can potentially feed off of if they're smaller fish. For larger fish, a little less likely, but if you have a little bit of algae that's been established, you got lots of algae eaters that are going to absolutely love that. Now they've got a place full of food.
Yep.
There's lots of things that I think if we take the biggest lesson, of course, in all aquatics is patience, right? This is such a patience oriented hobby. The more we rush, the more likely we are to fail. But the more we're like, yeah, if I take 3 months before I ever introduce fish to this fish tank, the fish, when they do get introduced, you're going to have a significantly higher chance of success than you would have if it was like, well, the water testing after a week says that I'm cycled. I see 0, 0, 0.
Yeah.
So clearly I'm ready for fish.
Oh, right.
let's go get those. I've been looking at those. It was the red glow tiger barbs. Let's go get those bad boys and hurl those things in there.
Oh,
for anybody who watches my channel, you know that I hate glowfish, but they get people like, you know, my nieces and nephews, or like my brother who are not aquatic. There's like, what is that really bright thing, right?
Yeah.
And that's, glowfish can be a tool for those of us in the hobby to introduce other people into the natural beauty of the world, as opposed to the artificial beauty of the world. But you got to hook them first, right? And sometimes glowfish are what hooks people.
It's definitely it's a massive fish, massive market for that. So I could see that being the entry level point. They're like, oh, what can I move from? Okay, I don't want to do this anymore. What else could I do? What else could I add it to? So I could see that being a thing. So for sure. All right. Let me ask you this, because I wanted to kind of get this, because there's a lot of different types and terminology out there, but I wanted to keep it somewhat basic. What's your working definition of the difference between a low tech tank and a high tech tank? You know, because people are gonna be like, I want to play in a tank, and they see all those terms, like, what do those things mean? Because I think that's going to be a thing.
This is like going to be one of my personal crusades in life. Probably is the eradication of low tech versus high tech.
Yeah.
So traditionally speaking, a low tech tank means no CO2. No injected CO2. And a high-tech tank means you're using typically like a big CO2 canister and pressurized injected CO2 to drastically increase what plants you can keep, the growth rate of those plants, and in some cases, the coloration of those plants. It allows you to really up your game as far as what your tank can handle, because it's, for those of us who've ever gone through some low-level biology classes, carbon is the building block of life. And when you add more and more carbon, the plants can grow more. Now, for me, I hate that definition. And I'll explain it really simply. The way I look at it is like this. I keep several tanks, which would be considered a high-tech setup.
Okay.
However, if every tank that has CO2 is high-tech, you actually lose a lot of important stratifications within that, because you could have a tank that is all very low demand plants, like the crypts behind me here.
Yeah.
You could have a really weak light, the base light and a fluval flex. It's not very powerful, but you could have CO2, and all of a sudden this low light, low demand tank is now a high tech tank.
That's a good point.
And it's deceptive in a sense that, like, you can have low demand tank plants, like the tank that's very commonly behind me in a lot of my videos is a 75-gallon long that I love, and it's full of mostly Java fern and crypts. There's very little beyond that, and it has injected CO2. It's set at about medium light, but it's all very low demand plants. And the thing is, it also only gets about 2 bubbles per second in a 75-gallon tank, which means it's not even hitting the 30 parts per million golden range of CO2 that a lot of our high-tech tanks target for. It's really sitting at about 15 parts per million, maybe 20, because it's got a slightly good fish load, so there's extra CO2 respiration happening.
Sure.
Is that high-tech? I would argue no. I would argue that it's medium tech. Yeah. It's medium light, but it's low demand plants. It has a little bit of CO2, but not a lot. And I think that's one of the stratifications. So traditionally, low tech means you are not injecting CO2. But you could have very powerful light, very high demand plants without CO2, and that's still considered low tech.
Yeah.
But you could have a $500 UNS Titan just blasting your tank with light. It's one of the best lights in the industry as far as its power is concerned.
Sure.
And yet, that would be a low-tech tank. Now, granted, in that scenario, you'd probably have a ton of algae because there's not enough to boost the growth to handle that kind of light.
Right.
But when the definition is so small, and there are some that will argue there's a few other definitions in there, but it's still like, traditionally most people are like, oh, is your tank low tech or high tech? And really all they mean is, are you using injected CO2? So that's kind of the way I've tried to change things. Is I like paying attention to the light demand of the tank. Is your tank low light, medium light, or high light in its demand? Not how much you give it, but how much the plants actually need. And then asking the secondary question, okay, now that we understand the light requirement for your tank, are you injecting CO2 or not? And then it's kind of like, I prefer looking at it as low demand, medium demand, high demand. And you could take it even kind of a step further and just go, is it lower energy, medium energy, or very high energy? Because if we have very high light and CO2 with really aggressive growing plants, you're working that tank a lot. And that tank's growing a ton. It's doing tons of stuff, right? It's taking in lots and lots of energy. Lots of light, lots of fertilizer, lots of carbon. It's growing like crazy. It looks amazing. You got some crazy Dutch aquascape or whatever it is.
Oh, yeah.
But you could have this dorky tank behind me with just a little CO2. And all of a sudden, that crazy Dutch aquascape and this are both high tech. And that has never made sense to me, especially someone who works in the technology field, where it's just like, your only defining thing between low and high is, does it have CO2? And not even does it have a certain rate of CO2, just does it have CO2?
Is it present?
It's one of those things that's driven me crazy. And thankfully, there's a few other people out there who have like tried to stratify that a little bit more. George Farmer's like a great example of like, he's in a similar page where he's like, I hate this definition.
For sure.
I don't know if he's quite as aggressive in the wording as I am, but it's one of those things where I think, generically speaking, it's a little better if we think about our light demand and then whether or not we add CO2, as opposed to high tech versus low tech. Because you can have all sorts of stuff that would be just fine in low tech, but you could decide to add CO2 because you want more robust growth, slightly different color, whatever it may be, from the benefits of CO2. And that's most frequently what I do. I run very low amounts of CO2 in most of my tanks when I'm running CO2. And it's a personal choice. I don't want things growing too fast. I work a ton. So I only have so much time to maintain my plants. So a lot of my tanks, it's like, that 40 breeder gets 1 bubble per second.
Yeah.
And for most people, they would be like, that's how much you put in a 10-gallon.
Yeah.
That's not even enough for what I put in my 10-gallon, for these guys who want their really crazy, your ADA aquascapes and stuff. It's like, it's nowhere near enough. And yet I still get a lot of the same benefits because it's just enough boost to make those plants a little bit better, a little bit healthier, a little bit more dense, a little bit better color. And yet that's high tech.
And it helps
very silly
in your own time frame too, right? You start adding all that and doing all that, it's going to create another, this one thing I try to mention to people is like, you don't want to create a second job for yourself, making things so overcomplicated with a lot of the different things you can do. You don't have to do that. I mean, if you want to, you're glad that you can, but if you start making things a lot more complicated and over doing all those things, you're going to get burnt out. And eventually it's not going to be any fun anymore because it's going to seem like a job. But if you keep things like, keep a lower rate of CO2, keep maybe some lower tech plants type, lower light plants, it's not as bad. And it's a lot easier to make it more enjoyable versus, difficult to deal with. And
you can still get some really amazing appearances in your tank, despite using like the low tech plants, if you have a little bit of patience.
Yeah.
There's some amazing stuff you can do with just Java Fern.
Yeah.
Just Java Fern in its various different versions. You can make some incredible looking tanks, and you could do it with just one plant. It's just about patience, letting that plant grow out and proliferate, or using, if you choose to use hardscape, what school you come from, whether you're like me, who is like, well, I keep rainbow fish. They're pretty dumb. They ram into hardscape all the time whenever they're sparring because they're beautiful, but they're not that smart. They just don't pay attention. No. So I have very limited hardscape, but I have lots of plants. So it creates a very different atmosphere. Yeah. And when you do incorporate, say you've got a guppy tank. Well, guppies swim around everything. They're a small fish. They're not super fast. Now you can start incorporating like big pieces of wood or lots of rock or something like that. And you can mix the hardscape and the plants in a way that even with very simple plants can give you a stunning tank. And more importantly, if you do have CO2 with those simple plants, as long as you're not using super aggressive growers like some of your stems, you don't have to maintain it that often.
Yeah.
And it just kind of naturally, if you balance it right, looks gorgeous, takes very little effort, and you just get to enjoy it a lot. And the most you have to do is do your water changes and clean your filters regularly.
And that's important. I try to tell people, like, hey, listen, if you keep everything on a schedule, whatever you're doing, planted tanks, normal tanks, you're going to have, it's just going to make things easier moving forward, because what's going to happen is if it's not on a schedule, you don't keep it there, it's more reactive than anything. Now you're reacting to something possibly going wrong, reacting to this. It's a little bit easier if you just keep everything. You still might have to react and, change things as you go, but it makes things, to me, I think, a little bit easier for people. So playing around it a little bit.
Totally agree. Even for those of us who break every rule that we say.
Same. I mean, sometimes it's happened. I mean, mine's a little bit different situation. We had a farm and a few buildings and greenhouses going up left and right now. Some things just change, but in our home aquariums, like I got a 55 behind me. My wife's about to put up three 5-gallon tanks. She likes doing shrimp. She's doing shrimp keeping.
Oh, so nice.
She's into shrimp. She's really big into that.
She's going to do 5 gallons. Well, that would be a Bentley recipe for failure, because I'm terrible with shrimp.
Oh, yeah.
The smaller the water volume, the more likely I am to screw it up.
Yeah, it's a lot of things. Yeah, she only does a few. Like we have a few red Rillies, like in a 5-gallon, like just a handful. Like not even a handful. I think it's three or four. Like she doesn't do many. I'm like, it's gonna have a lot of babies. You're gonna have a lot of biload. Like you're gonna have to check that out. But fortunate for us, when you do get too many, we just move them out to the store.
Yeah,
like, there you go.
You have the perfect scenario for shrimp. It's like, I have too many shrimp. Poor me, I'm gonna have to sell some.
Oh man, for sure. Well, let me ask you this. I know we talked about different low light, medium tanks, and the difference between the two terms, right? So let's talk about what those setups look like, and I'll kind of break down the different components people are looking at. Like, I mean, we have people talk about does there a certain size aquarium you think goes better for a planted tank versus not? Is there like a minimum tank size you would use, or a type of tank you like better as a preference?
So my preference, this part of this is just because I absolutely keep so many rainbow fish too. So like naturally I go to bigger tanks. I love the 40 breeder, but I also think that one of the best tanks for a small tank and doing some plants is a 20 long.
Ooh.
I love 20 long planted tanks because you can do a lot of simpler stuff, but it can look much more lush and robust in that shallower tank.
Yeah.
You don't necessarily have to use stem plants because you're not dealing with a very tall tank. So it's one of the first things I'd like to break down is let's pay attention to the tank we want to do, because you can do a planted tank in a 2-gallon tank. You can do it in a 5-gallon tank. You can do it in a 500-gallon tank. That's the best part about planted tanks. The difference is that 5-gallon tank, you don't want anything that grows too aggressively, because you're going to be in that tank every other day dealing with it. You want something that goes slow. So that's where you can start looking at something like the small anubiases or bucephalandras, and even some of the Java fern species, where you can get the ones that don't grow too tall, like Java fern Wendelov, right? This is a great example of a Java fern that only goes so tall, and then it gets these nice little lacy edges to its leaf.
Yeah.
But if you were to put in like Pogostemon octopus, a super aggressive growing stem, or water sprite, that thing's going to fill your tank up every week.
You'll be done. That's all you'll have.
It'll just be a nightmare. Yeah. So the first thing that I like to think about is, okay, what is the tank I'm dealing with? If it's a smaller tank, I want to go with lower demand plants, a little less light. You don't want to have too much light, because if you have too much light and low demand plants, you will get algae. Period. Just assume it. But if you dial some of those things back, it can work very, very effectively. Bigger tank, taller tank. Now you can start looking into some of those things that do grow more aggressively, like your stem plants or Vallisneria or some of those taller plants, and know that, I only have to trim my tank every 3 weeks or so. It hits a certain point. Now it's getting too tall. I trim. I keep the best stems I want, or I just keep what stems are down low and let it regrow in, and I either get rid of that old stuff, or I sell it, or I move it to a different tank, whatever you might do with it. But if we first examine the tank we're trying to do, then determine, okay, am I trying to aquascape a little bit? Am I going to have some wood and rock, or am I just going to have plants? Because if you're just going to have plants, you can look at something that takes up more space.
All right.
So I would say, like, some of the common sizes out there, I think a 20-gallon long is amazing, because you can do a ton of stuff with it with very low demand plants, and it will look fantastic.
Yeah.
Like things like your crypts, your Java ferns, your anubias, all these things that are low light, slower growers, but you could you want to boost their growth, put a tiny amount of CO2 in there, like literally one bubble a second. It is just enough to boost the growth. It'll make them more robust, more healthy. It'll help fight off that algae a little bit. If you keep your light nice and low, you won't have to deal with too much of the problems. And those plants in low light grow faster.
Awesome. Yeah.
The second thing that I would look at is like, make sure that you identify the demand of the plant and have your light accordingly. You do not want to get a Fluval Plant 3.0 light if you're going to be on a 20-gallon long with just a Nubius. It's too powerful, even though you can adjust it in the app. So it's kind of technically a bad answer. But if you get a super powerful light, you don't want it on max. Even though it looks brighter to our eyes, it's going to cause problems.
Yeah.
Make sure that you get a light that fits the demand of the plants and especially the height of the tank. Taller tanks, you can have a slightly more powerful light. Shallower tanks, those 20 longs, a 33 long, even a 40 breeder, technically, it's a little shallower. You don't need as powerful a light. The plants will do okay. That's like the biggest thing I would say is try to adjust your plants and their demands to whatever tank you're doing. If you're going to do like a big 125-gallon tank, you got lots of room, dude, Amazon swords, Madagascar lace, get some of those plants that get big.
Real big.
Give them time and they look incredible. A big sword, when it's big and lush, if you plant it toward the center of a tank or you get it like when they just flush out and they get huge, they look incredible.
They do.
Or like Madagascar lace. I've had a Madagascar lace at one point where it had like 4-foot-long leaves.
Good Lord.
And it was in a 90-gallon. And so these leaves are going all over the place, but they look incredible.
Man.
When you get them to that size. So when you have that bigger tank, you can still take those plants that are technically low demand. In a sense, they have a higher nutrient demand, but they don't like super high light. And you can mix them with some of those other plants that do like that high light, your stems and some of your more aggressive things, or like even your floating plants, if you want to use something to shade those low demand plants a little bit so you can keep a mix of high and low and still have strong light.
Right.
And now you can do a lot. So understand the first thing is pay attention to your tank. What's your plan? Because if your plan is like, I just want something simple, I want to see more of my fish, go with something slow and simple like your Java ferns. If you want to pay more attention, you want to do like have tons of space and all this color and all this stuff and then just fill it with shrimp. But you want something big and crazy, kind of like you've seen a Dutch aquascape tank and you're like, man, I want that. Yeah. I want this crazy nonsense. Go get yourself a 40 breeder. Go get yourself even a 29-gallon. Get something that's a little taller than it is necessarily like something like a 20 long, right? Yeah. Or look into like get a 75. Get something big. Get something that gives you room so that you can put a ton of stuff in it. Just understand that when you put higher light and higher demand plants, you're going to do more maintenance. So if you don't want to do a lot of maintenance, avoid the high demand plants. Yeah. Stick to your low stuff. Don't put your light too high. Let them just naturally grow in and do their thing, and it will look great. Or go that high demand, be willing to take that time, be that person who's out in their garden every weekend, tending to everything, making it look immaculate, but then it will look immaculate. Yeah. Your own schedule and your tank are two very, very important things before you ever consider the plants. Then you can consider the plants. And then if you decide I'm going with high demand plants, now I need a more powerful light. Sure. Or I need to have CO2. Right? It's not like if you go into it going, I want to have CO2 and a really strong light. Okay, great. I've bought the best light out there. I've bought CO2. I've got all the best things I can do. And then you buy a 10-gallon. You're probably going to have an algae farm no matter what you do. Or your plants are going to grow so fast that you can't keep up with them.
And that could create even more problems in a different direction. So it's going to be, for most people listening, definitely, I don't know how to say this, but you got to see what best fits you and then kind of work around that, I guess, kind of like summarize a little bit what you're doing. And I wanted to ask you this. I know you mentioned lights, different intensities, different size tanks. Most people are like, well, do I need a planted light? Do I need a specific kind of light? Can I,
Sure.
are there
Sure.
are there some brands that are better than others, or some lights that are better than others? Is there a cheaper version? And like, what does that look like? Because if you tell someone go buy a plant light, they go to Amazon, right? Because that's probably got a first step for a lot of people, I imagine.
Yeah.
And there's 95 different things to pick from. They have all the different wattages, all the different everything's. Like, they're like, oh my God, what do I do?
Oh man, I cannot tell you the number of videos I've made about light. It's one of the things I talk about really, really regularly. But so the first thing I would say, especially if you're starting out, wattage doesn't matter that much. In modern LEDs, watts don't matter. And if you do your research online, you'll see rules like watts per gallon. Ignore that. That's for old fluorescent lighting. It has nothing to do with modern LEDs. It's a complete fallacy in a modern LED, because the power requirements to get the same amount of brightness out of an LED compared to a fluorescent light is nowhere near the same. LEDs are significantly more powerful as far as the intensity of light they can create for significantly less power. Right. So don't ever assume that you need a certain number of watts based on the size of your tank. That won't help you. That's more likely to hurt you than anything else.
Right.
Second, there's kind of great, I would say, stratifications of lights. And if you really want an easy buying guide, I would say that if you're doing a shallower tank, look at the Phoenix Stingray 1. It's just a great light. 20 longs, even a standard 20 gallon, a 10 gallon. They're great lights. You could go with something a little more powerful that has some adjustment to it. And so some examples there would be like a light. There's either JCMP or Higer, which they're Chinese companies, but they're newer, kind of more powerful lights that are really, really price efficient. You can use those. Just understand that you don't want to run them at full power in most of those smaller tanks. You want to dial them down a little bit. Typically somewhere like 30 to 40% of their power. And then you can go all the way up. For you have your bigger tanks, you want to have a little bit more control maybe. And that's one of the biggest things that I would say when you start getting into the more expensive lighting is you get things like Bluetooth app control, where you can really mess and tinker with your light quite a lot, as opposed to just like, well, I turn it on and I turn it off.
Right.
That's it. You get a lot more control. And that's where you start looking at something like the entry-level version would be the Fluval Aqua Sky, which is a fantastic light, especially, again, in those shallower tanks, those ones that aren't quite as tall, up to about a 40 breeder. They're great. Once you get taller than that, or if you just need more intense light, the Fluval Plant Light, I think, is probably the best bang for your buck light out there. There's a few newer ones that I haven't had an opportunity to play with yet. There's some of the newer Phoenix 24/7 versions of their plant lights.
Oh, yeah.
That I've seen a lot of people have really positive results with. And then there's the ultra crazy stuff that's out there. There's your Chihiros Vivid 2 or your UNS Titan or your ADA Solar RGB, these things that cost you like $400 and $500 per light. Yeah. You don't need those. You just don't. Trust me, you're not doing the thing that needs the ONF flat one or any of these like really insane lights that you see on the really, really high level aquascaping channels. Yeah. You don't need that crazy stuff yet. No. You might get to that point where you do want that light, but you probably don't need it on your first tank.
Yeah.
A lot of times what I would say is understand, like figure out the requirement of those plants and then buy the light based on that. One of the best investments you're going to have in your tank for plants is the light. So don't necessarily have to buy the most expensive light, but don't always look for the cheapest possible solution, because a lot of times the cheapest possible solution is either A, not going to last you very long, or B, it's not tuned that well. And every light that says it's a plant light, they're all different. And one of the things that I would say is find something that doesn't have too much blue light. Okay. Blue light really helps algae take off in most tanks. And if you can't control the blue spectrum of light, like for example, in the Fluval lights, they had their own smart app. You can just control it with your phone. I turned the blue almost completely off on every one of my lights. That's one of the Fluval lights, because you need so little blue. It's not even one of the light spectrums that plants actually take the most advantage of if you want to get into the deep science behind it. But algae does.
Right.
And no one likes fighting algae unless, of course, your goal is to have a bristlenose pleco tank. And then I guess crank that blue light. And get all that algae, because they'll eat it all day long, So The other thing I would say is if your light doesn't have a built-in timer of some form, or you don't necessarily trust that timer, maybe you deal with power outages quite a lot where you're at, and you lose power for 15 minutes at a time regularly, get yourself one of those like Wi-Fi smart plugs. You know, get yourself some kind of hard physical timer. There's also the old, like, they're like a big rotating dial and you push all the things in or you pull them out.
Buttons out.
You know, those are also effective. To be honest. Well, I still have some. I've been slowly converting myself to Wi-Fi timers because I found the one I like the most, which is the Casa Smart. They're made by a company called TP-Link, which is in the networking and routing space. And they make really good equipment. So it's one of the ones I trust. They're slightly more expensive than a lot of like the knockoff Chinese ones, but I'll take that for knowing that it's just a better product and has a really good interface on my phone to control. And make sure that you control your light. Because one thing you also don't want is inconsistent timing your light. You don't want to be, well, yeah, today I turned it on at 6 a.m., but then tomorrow it's 7 a.m. The day after it's 8 a.m. And I got home late from work, so I didn't turn my light off until 10 p.m. You know, or you could be the crazy person like me who loves to run like 13 hours of light a day. Don't do that. Don't do what I do. Don't run 13 hours of light to start. You know, typically what I would say is somewhere between 6 and 8 hours of light is really good. It's controllable. It's less likely to deal with algae outbreaks, especially if you're beginning, and you can expand that over time as your knowledge grows. But use a timer so that your tank gets the same consistent light every day. And you'll find way more success that way than you will by buying the best light.
Right.
And the best this and the best that. Consistency is so much more important than the best. You can get away with a less powerful light as long as you consistently control that light. And try to avoid the lights that have like one full line of white and one full line of blue. That's like that's your absolute enemy. But if it has a lot of red light, that's perfectly fine. Red light is great for plants. Algae doesn't take very much advantage of red light. So you can look at like I think one of the best examples of that is, it's a pretty cheap light, is the Phoenix Fuse Ray that has a lot of red. Now it'll stain a red tone to a lot of things you're looking at. So if you have red fish, they're going to pop way more. If you're red plants, they're going to pop way more. But if you have a lot of blue, you might not want that because it'll mute that blue some because it's too much red light. Yeah. So generic white light is your good friend. But getting a mixture of different things, if something has, the biggest thing I would say is don't look at a light and try to find the most color LEDs possible. That doesn't matter so much. Plants don't care about that. Plants just care that the light lands within a specific spectrum, which is called PAR, which is the photosynthetically active radiation, if you want the science behind that. But basically that's the bandwidth of light that plants can utilize. And then within that, there's all sorts of little nuance you don't need to know, but just as long as it sits with most typical plant lights are going to naturally sit in that, and that makes it easy. So if you just want to look for the plant light, it's going to be faster. The only the caution I would tell is if you're going directly to eBay or to Amazon or whatever, don't use a quote grow light. Don't use the things that are designed for indoor terrestrial basement tomato farming. You use the stuff that is designed for an aquarium, and it's going to cost you a little bit more, yes, but in the long run, they're designed for aquatic plants, and you're going to have more success that way.
Okay. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense as far as like, you know, hey, if you're looking for lights, you know, I guess the main point I was trying to point is like, you don't have to buy the best of everything. You don't trying to buy hundreds and hundreds of dollars of lights. You don't need that to start with your first planted tank. It's not at all. It's not required. You can, yeah.
You can buy some of those nice lights. Like I love the Fluval Plant 3.0. I love that light to death. And you can buy that light because you have a lot of control in it, and you can turn the power down. But at the same time, like you're taking this very powerful light that costs you anywhere between $150 and $200, where you could have bought the more entry-level version of light, the Aqua Sky, which still has the same level of control, but it's not as powerful. And if you were on like a 40 breeder or a 20 long, you saved yourself $50 to $80, and you got all the light you actually needed with the same level of control.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And it even has the same warranty in that case, right? Or you can get the JCMP or Hygger lights, which are very cheap lights, you know, in comparison to some of those nicer lights, but they don't have a manual control on them. So you can't create like a sunrise and a sunset, all this crazy nonsense that you don't necessarily need.
Yeah.
But like the enthusiast level people like me go gaga for, right? We love playing with these things. We're like trying to simulate an actual day cycle. We're trying to make nature in our homes. it like that's what that's for. But if you just want a good looking planet tank, you can go get a $40 or $50 light, as long as it's one of the right ones. Like a Fennec Stingray is a great example. The JCMP or Hygger lights are great examples. There's several other brands that are out there. Do your research. Take your time. Find dum-dums like me on YouTube and watch their videos. And just find if enough people say that this light's great, it's probably a good light.
Yeah.
But if only one guy says that that's like it's great, and that happens to be the same guy selling that light, I would be a little skeptical. Same. Putting that one out there, you know. And then from there, just make sure you have it timed. Timing is the biggest bane of a lot of people. A lot of people say, I turn my light on in the morning and I turn it off when I get home. Why am I always dealing with algae? Well, that light's been on for 12 hours a day.
Yeah.
You know, set a Wi-Fi timer up, have that thing turn on like half an hour before you're gonna be around that fish tank in the morning. You enjoy your fish tank, have it turn off like after 3 hours or something like that. Have it stay off for a while in the middle of the day. We call that a siesta. And then have it come back on like half an hour before you expect to come home. That way your fish are awake and they're ready. Enjoy your fish tank for a little bit in the night. Have it on for another 3 or 4 hours. Turn it off again. Yep. You got two miniature days. You get to enjoy your fish tank at the 2 times you're at home. If you have a work schedule, are you home all the time? Just find a nice 6 to 8 hour block. Have it on during that period of time and turn it off, and you'll do just fine. It'll cut down so many problems if your lighting is consistent every single day, and you don't necessarily buy the most powerful light, but you buy the better light for what your application is.
Sure. So you don't always need the best light. You could, but getting a light that's appropriately sized for whatever tank you're going to put it on. It's a 40 breeder, 20 long, 10 gallon. It could be a 5 gallon. They have nano lights now too. I've seen a few out there. So that's interesting to me.
Yeah.
So something cool for that. Let me ask you about this. Fertilizers for beginners. Is that something you think you could pull off? Is that a good thing? Are there brands that are easier to use than others? Do they need to use multiple kinds? What's your take on the fertilizer realms for beginner planet tanks? Okay.
So you are immediately going to now need to have a chemistry degree. No, I'm just kidding. So the best part about fertilizer is that the market has responded, and some could argue that, you know, the first person to respond to that was probably Aquarium Co-op, in the sense that they made easy green. They took a fertilizer, they put a pump head on it, and they designed the solution to be 1 pump for every 10 gallons in your tank.
Yep.
And if your tank is really low demand, so you got a lot of those low light easy plants like your Anubiases and your Java ferns, and you have low light on it, you're not putting high light, you only have to do it once a week.
Yeah.
So it's literally like you could change your water out, and the next day I have a 20-gallon tank. I put in 2 pumps. I'm done.
That's
easy.
Good. Yeah.
Now, if you have a little bit more light, they suggest you do it twice a week, and you'd space that out. I personally have one would argue crazy person's philosophy on fertilizing. It's just that I take the way that the most complicated fertilizing out there is, which is estimated index.
Yeah.
And I take that mentality and I apply it to my all-in-one fertilizers. Okay. So I'm lazy. I love all-in-one fertilizers, like the Easy Green, Thrive. There's a million of them. They pick whatever brand you want. That's actually the part that matters the least. About the only one that changes in there is the Seachem Flourish line, because it is specifically formulated with a really complex dosing regime, because they use a lot of different side products and all this stuff. And they have this very complex regime that they want you to do, using all of those products to most efficiently get things out of it. So I would say find something like, for me in the US, the two that I always think of the most are like Thrive and Easy Green, because those are the ones that are local or I see the most. But there's almost everybody who does plants and some kind of thing has their own fertilizer. Like there's Dustin's Grow Juice. There's Greg Sage has a powdered fertilizer that you can use at a very small amount, but it's an all-in-one, right?
Yeah.
And there's a lot of different options. So pick the one you want. I'll probably use Easy Green just because that's what I commonly use. Another one that I do like a lot though is Brightwell's line of stuff and I'll explain that in a minute, but they have a little kind of change on how you do things. But basically I like to do spread my dosing out as evenly as possible. Okay. So an example would be if I use a 40-gallon breeder and my 40-gallon breeder has some CO2 and medium light, I need to dose more than once a week. So I would be dosing, in theory, 4 pumps twice a week. So it's 8 pumps total in a week. Well, instead I'll change that and I'll do like 1 pump a day. And a couple times a week, I'll add in 2 pumps instead of the 1 just to get that little extra boost, especially as my planting gets more dense. And then over time, or it'll be something like I'll do 3 pumps every other day, something like that, where it's like if when I have a really densely planted tank and I'm doing CO2 and medium light, I need to use more fertilizer because there's more plants to consume more of. It's just like when you get more and more fish, you need to add more food, right? Yeah, I like to spread that out so that I have kind of consistently a lean amount of nutrients always in the water, always available for plants. And when you do that, you tend to see less issues with algae. Okay. So in our example, if you do have a 20-gallon tank and you're all low demand plants, you only need those 2 pumps a week, right? So do 1 pump every 3 days. And on the 7th day, water change. It's an easy schedule. You just literally put that pump fertilizer in, then grab your fish food, feed your fish. Easy peasy. That's your morning routine. It's nice and easy. That. And then what it does is it makes more consistent fertilizer and nutrients. You have we can get into the nutrients a little bit, but you have all the stuff, the building blocks for those plants to succeed constantly available in the water instead of a big dose once and that has to last the whole week. Instead, you have a smaller dose more frequently, and then you're less likely to encounter algae issues, and you're going to get more continuous, robust growth. Right. Because there isn't like starvation period and all the fertilizer ever period. You just have a consistent, continuous dose going through. Now, the difference here is that if you do have a really high fish load, or if you know your water, and your water has nitrates in it naturally, because there's several people who have well water or some kind of city water where they naturally have 20 parts per million nitrate. Yeah. Well, that's enough nitrate if you're regularly water changing to feed your plants, especially if you have a heavier fish load. So you could change to a different fertilizer. And my example here is going to be Brightwell's Florin Multi. So Florin Multi is all of the micronutrients, or what we call our trace minerals. This is a lot of the stuff that is in an all-in-one, but are really important in small amounts. Right. And then it has potassium, which is one of the things that you just never find in water naturally, but is what we call a macronutrient, or one of the more important building blocks for a lot of plants. Right. But it doesn't have nitrate in it, and it doesn't have phosphorus in it. Oh. So if you have a heavier fish load where you're naturally getting a lot of nitrates, or maybe you notice like I've been using that all-in-one fertilizer, and I constantly test and I have 20 to 40 or even over 40 nitrates. Well, you probably have enough nitrates in your water to pull that fertilizer and change it and use something that doesn't include nitrogen. And now all you're doing is all the other stuff that the plants actually need, and you're allowing your fish waste to turn into that nitrogen that the plants need and the phosphorus, because you're going to get phosphorus in that way too through all your fish foods and stuff like that. And now you have an even easier fertilizer to use, but you're adjusting for your water. So this is why one of the biggest things I ever preach is like, know your water. Once you know your water, it helps you with so many problems down the road. It's almost the end all be all for a lot of issues a lot of people are having on their aquariums for any reason, especially when you start doing planted tanks. It's nice to know, if you know what your baseline is, you can make your adjustments and say, this is where I need to be. Obviously, this is where I can, where my water is, and you can at least see some pitfalls and say, I need to avoid X, Y, Z. It's all going to be different based on everyone's specific situation, but at least you can make
that determination then, rather than at the last minute being like, what do I do? Well, I don't know what's wrong. And then you might not know, because fertilizers could throw off your, if it throws off your pH or something throws off something else, you won't know the real,
exactly.
The problem behind it.
Yeah,
the cause. There we go. Words are hard today,
the root cause. Hey man, we're here on a mysterious day. No, it's a Saturday. We're supposed to not be engaging our brains. It's Saturday morning.
Yeah. Nope, not yet. I'm trying not to, but I'm there. But so it's working. So let me ask you this. Yeah. A lot of people look through when they're putting together their planted tanks. They're like, well, I see these. They have planted substrates. They've got eco completes. They've got shred. Are these things required for having these sort of low tech tanks? Can they put gravel in there or sand? What do you think?
This is where understanding your plants really matters. So an example would be if you're using epiphyte plants. These are the plants that attach to wooden rocks. So Java fern, Anubias, Bucephalandra, and Bulbitis are the most common examples. Yeah. Or you're using mostly floating plants, then you do not need a planted tank substrate at all.
Yeah.
Now, if you want to use a lot of your rosette plants, these are the things that build heavier root systems. They feed more from their roots, like cryptocorynes, your sword plants, some of your fern type plants. So like water sprite, water wisteria tend to build really robust root structures. Your grassier plants like Vallisneria, or a lot of the carpeting plants like your Monte Carlos and things like that. Your smaller plants, which I guess we could get into those later, but avoid those if you're starting out, please.
Yeah.
You'll save yourself so many headaches. But any of these things that really build robust root systems, now you do want to start looking at more planted tank substrates. You don't necessarily have to. There's a lot of people who'll be like, why would you do that? You can do a dirted tank. You could do the Wallstad tank. I caution a lot of beginners against dirted tanks because they have a ton of requirements that are really easy to screw up. It's really easy to screw up the dirted tank and cause a nightmare of ammonia issues, or having too many nutrients to get up into your water column, and very easily dealing with massive algae outbreaks, or potentially poisoning your fish, and lots of scary stuff that just, it feels horrible when you encounter them. And I can speak from experience. I've done a dirty tank in the past. I did it very early on because I was like, oh, this is a great way to do a cheap, like the next tank I want to do, instead of that really expensive substrate system I did on that first tank.
Yeah.
I'll save myself a ton of money there, and then I can get more fish, or I can get more plants. Yeah. And it was a nightmare because I didn't do it right. And I watched like one video that was just like, yeah, you just put a little bit of dirt on, you just tie a little gravel over the top to hold it all down. It's like, but didn't really tell me like, yeah, so if you put 1 inch of dirt in, you need 3 inches of cap.
Yeah.
And the finer the cap, the better, like sand, to help make sure that that dirt never gets exposed to the upper water column. Because that's when the issues occur. And so I just used some generic pea gravel. I was like, oh, just gravel? I'll go to a Home Depot. I can buy a big old bag of gravel, dirt cheap.
Yep.
It's rock. It don't cost nothing. I'll rinse it out. I'll sprinkle some over the top so it looks nice. But the thing was, it wasn't enough of it. So it exposed it to the water column, and just a giant soupy mess. And after I let it settle, and I thought, okay, now I'm good. Now there's just too much stuff in the water. It was an algae bomb that I couldn't beat. I couldn't stop it. It was a nightmare.
Sounds like a big nightmare. Like,
so I learned my lesson in long term. But what I learned is when I'm dealing with some of the things like your Echo Complete, or Fluval Stratum, Brightwell's Rio Oscuro, there's ADA Amazonia, there's UNS Contra soil. There's a million different of these types of aqua soils. And yes, they cost a little bit more money. They totally do. But the big difference is, in those aqua soils, they naturally have what we call the cation exchange capacity, or CEC. And what that does, in short, not too sciencey terms, is it pulls nutrients out of the water into the soil. And these are what we refer to as active substrates, because they alter your water parameters.
Right.
Whereas things like sand and gravel are what we call inert. They do not interact with the water parameters. And the big thing that matters to understand here is you have plants that draw from their root system, which is a lot of plants. Even stem plants draw a reasonable amount from their root system. That substrate, those active substrates, will pull nutrients out of the water column. So when you do your liquid fertilizer, they're going to use that CEC, and it's going to cause this fun sciencey thing called ions, right? They're going to pull in some of that stuff using ion capacity and the way that ion bonding occurs. And what it does is it makes it available at the roots. And now those plant roots can absorb all those nutrients that the active substrate has pulled in for them.
Okay.
So that's where we want substrates. Active substrates are fantastic for helping our root feeders. Also, they're mostly designed in a way that makes them easy to plant into. They're a little bit finer, but not so fine that they're going to choke a root system out. Like pool filter sands or some of your cheap playground sands a lot of people like to use. Right. Those can compact really easily, especially in thicker layers. And if you're only doing 2 to 3 inches, it's probably not an issue, but it can be a lot harder for those plants to propagate themselves naturally and build really robust root systems in that denser, more fine grain substrate. Whereas those little clay balls and all that kind of stuff, or like some of the more volcanic type substrates where they're look more as like miniature lava rock almost, you know, those things are more porous, they're more open. It's easier for roots to grab onto them, to spread and move through them and establish a more robust system. And this helps the plants have a much healthier long-term life. So do you have to have them? No. Does it make it a lot easier when you do? As long as those plants require some level of being planted in the substrate? Most definitely. And I think aside from light, decent substrate is usually a really good investment for the long-term health of a tank. And a lot of people, one misconception that's out there, this typically comes from the highest echelons of aquascaping, and where they have these insane demands that the average person isn't dealing with, is that your substrate only lasts for like 2 years. No, your substrate will last way longer than that. I have a tank downstairs that is used substrate from someone else. I bought the tank and the substrate together. He had the substrate in there for 3 years. I've had that tank for another 4.5 afterward. And it's just to the gills full of plants. And a lot of them are crypts, and they're as healthy as can be because there's plenty of stuff down in that substrate for them to feed off of.
That's awesome.
It's still got its CEC. It's still pulling in nutrients to make available to them. Don't worry about the lifespan of any of those decent substrates. It's way longer than people advertise. Part of that advertising is because they want to sell you more substrate.
Go get more. No, that's a good point to make, because I think more. that would be a definitely a big thing, because they're just like, oh, this is going to be gone in like 2 years. Oh no, some have longer lifespans than others. So that's good to know. All right, let me ask you this. I know we touched on it briefly, but I know you mentioned like a schedule, like a maintenance schedule. Yes. What about sort of like, reiterate that real quick, and then tools that make this easier if they're going to plant plants? Do you find anything? Is there anything that makes it easier to, like, they're shoving the plants in there? Is it something that helps with this?
Yeah. So, if I was smart, I would have been prepared and brought the only tool I think you actually need. A reasonable set of, whether you call them pin sets or tweezers or whatever, a reasonable pair of those. Now, the good news is you don't have to buy the super expensive, like you'll see those Aqua Vitro or ADA or whatever. You can buy the generic ones on Amazon. You'll do just fine. There's lots of kits that are like a 3 or 4 piece kit, but really all that matters is get yourself a decent pair of tweezers or pin sets, however you want to call them. I personally prefer the straight. So just the long straight with a really thin needle to them almost.
Okay.
So like I want a less thick prong, because it's a lot easier to put a plant in, release that plant deep in the substrate, and move the tweezer away so it doesn't drag that plant back out, and pull the tweezer out when the metal itself is thinner.
Okay.
It's my local fish store and they make all their own, but like Aquarium Co-op has their own branded version. Just look at that one, that style. Get that style. And you don't have to buy from them. You can buy it off Amazon. You'll find a million that look the same. They're all basically the same piece of equipment. There's not a massive difference. in quality until you start going to like the really crazy person levels, like, you know, this dumb here, right? then you get people who are like, yeah, no, I bought that $75 pair of aquascaping tweezers. Like, you spent how much? Yeah, I bought mine for like $5 on Amazon. What are you doing? You crazy? And it's like, it only matters when you're like a real nutso person, right? But really, you can get a cheap set, and then second to that is a decent pair of scissors.
Okay.
You don't want to use you don't want to go buy like the El Cheapo, you know, your dollar store scissors or something like that. You want something that's got a good sharp edge, and more importantly, has a rather the easiest way to put this is like the sharpest tool possible that's built to handle the water. And a lot of times you'll want something that's a little longer. There's a lot of different variations and styles that are out there, but a good pair of scissors goes a long way. And the only reason why you don't want a bigger, broader blade like you would use a standard pair of kitchen shears or something like that is certain plants, if you have that broader blade, it crushes before it cuts. And when you crush certain plants, Anubias is the best example here. It actually causes longer term health issues in the plant that can lead to, most commonly, this is an Anubias. We have a thing called Anubias rot. And one of the easiest ways to trigger Anubias rot is by crushing the rhizome too much.
Right.
So very often with plants like that, Anubias is the biggest example because it has that big, thick, like, you know, it's almost like trying to cut through my pinky. Right? Yeah. It's this big, thick root piece that we call in the rhizome. You're actually better off cutting that with a razor blade because it's so fine and so sharp that it applies no crushing pressure. It applies cutting pressure.
Right.
And that crushing pressure can lead to an issue longer term in the stem's health or the rhizome's health. Whereas a good, sharp pair of proper scissors goes a long way. Now, again, you can find a cheap pair of part of a kit in Amazon, and it's going to do a lot of what you need. And in some cases, you don't even need scissors. If you're dealing with almost all stems, you're not dealing with things like Anubiases or Java ferns. If you have some nails, like I have an okay nail, and you can barely even see it on my thumb there.
No,
I can just clip with my thumb, and it's fine. You can pinch if you have nails. It's enough. If you can break it, it's not a really reedy stem where it's kind of tough. If you can easily break it with your fingers, that's enough. Just don't be like trying to yank the thing like this, you know. If you need to do that, get yourself a pair of scissors. But you can get cheaper scissors. You don't have to buy the crazy expensive. You don't need surgical scissors. You don't need all this nonsense that you'll see a lot of people be like, yeah, no, you have to have this. Like, that's because they sell that.
Yeah.
You know, that's why they say that. It's because they sell that, and they want you to buy the thing they sell.
Sure.
But you know, you can get away with cheaper implements in this place, and really all you need is a good pair of tweezers, and it helps to have a decent pair of scissors, and that's about it. Other than that, you don't really need too many tools other than your head. You know, just use your eyes and your brain, you'll be all right. Now, as far as the other part of your question, beyond the tools, maintenance and schedule, I would say, first off, understand what your natural water change schedule is. Are you the person that does your water change every 2 weeks? Are you doing it every week? Are you doing a water change every 3 days and you do smaller water changes? Make sure that you do any trimming of plants you want to do before you water change. So get in there in the old tank water, knowing that you got to do it. If it's time to trim your plants up. That way, any leaves or stuff that get to the top of your water, when you go, you can net them out or whatever and get them out of the way. Then do your water change, get your fresh water in there, and use your fertilizer dosing around your water change schedule. So if you want to water change once a week and you're going to dose twice a week with your fertilizer, try to make it so that the day right after your water change is when you do your next dose of fertilizer. So if you're doing every 3 days, let's say, right, the thing I recommended earlier, you got that 20-gallon tank, you're putting in one pump every 3 days. You know, it's Monday I put in a pump of fertilizer. Tuesday, Wednesday I don't. Thursday I put in a pump of fertilizer. Friday, Saturday I don't touch it. Sunday I water change. Monday, fertilizer.
Yeah.
Right? Make sure that what you're doing is at the tail end, any excess nutrients that may still be lying around, we're trying to dilute those with our water change so that we can start our cycle over again. And if you go into the higher levels of fertilizer, you want to go real crazy, really get deep down the water hole for more advanced users. You look at a type of fertilizing called estimated index. This is a really crazy fertilizer regime, but it can lead to incredible results. This is what a lot of your really high level aquascapers and plant psychopaths like me, but less lazy than me, would do, right? And the difference here is they use their water changes to remove a majority of the excess nutrients in their water because of how that regime is done.
Okay.
So similar mentality, after they're done dosing for 6 days, because they dose every single day in estimated index, then they use a big 50% water change. They pull all that stuff out. Now they've reset their basically their weekly cycle, and they go back in dosing fertilizer. So I would try to set your maintenance around that. Just know that, is it time to trim my stems? Okay. Or trying to trim any of my plants? Let's do that before we water change. That way any excess debris or whatever we can clean. Or more importantly, we remove all that excess plant matter. Now we can get in and if we want to do some gravel vac or a little bit of skimming, get some of any of that debris or mulm or whatever that got trapped in some of those plants as they got really dense and thick. Get that stuff out of there in our water change afterward. Because if you do it beforehand, you can't access it, right?
Right.
So there's lots of little things you can do for long-term health. And I think the biggest thing is, in that regard, make sure your maintenance is in a kind of set schedule, but that is controllable for you. You don't want to be designed like, okay, I have to dose every single day, so and I can water change every third day. But if you can't keep up with that, don't set your schedule up to be like that. Do the schedule you can do and adjust everything else accordingly, so that it just works in a nice harmony. You'll have lots of success doing it that way.
That is the best. I mean, that's a great point. I know we've mentioned it a few times, but please, when you're looking inside of these planting tanks, try to get something that fits your schedule versus something you think might not, because it's just going to create more headaches for you, I think, in the end. And
I think I won't lie. I think my next like grand crusade is going to be like preaching how important low maintenance plants are.
Yeah,
because it makes it so much easier on, especially us as really busy folks, right? And everybody's busy these days. Like just nothing goes slow anymore.
No, nothing does.
Everybody's like running at 1 million miles a minute with their head cut off. You gotta, if you take your time and like dial back the requirement of your plants, makes life so much easier. You don't have to do as much maintenance. And really it just comes down to, are you fertilizing correctly and are you water changing correctly? You don't got to trim all that often. And usually when you do trim, it's like, oh, look, I got these whole new baby plants I can move somewhere. Ah, great. I can start that next tank now. I've got plants to plant it right away. Perfect.
And that's perfect. That's a perfect little schedule. I mean, I think that's, I don't know. I just like the point. I don't know. For me, when I look at tanks, we have fish here on the farm, but when I have personal tanks, I want them to be as easy as possible. I want to spend time looking at them, but I don't want to spend time just constantly trying to maintain everything 24/7. I'm like, all right, I already do that enough as it is. I want to enjoy my own tank.
I spent enough time with my arms elbow deep in a fish tank.
I'm cleaning every day. We're siphoning hundreds of tanks a day, so I need to just give me a minute.
Well, if you ever decide I'm not siphoning enough tanks, you're welcome to come out to my place and do mine too.
Perfect. I will put it on my list. I definitely will do that. Oh man. Let me ask you this, because I know this would probably be the two most common issues people will see is, all right, I started my planting tank. I got a lot of algae. Oh no, I did something incorrectly or just not as well as I should. What should they do for algae issues they have when they're first starting out?
Sure. So the two most common things that I see is either there's too much light when we're early in a tank and we're getting algae. Especially in the time when our plants are converting. So we have brand new plants. We just bought them from, Joe's Plant Shack. They came in these nice little bundles. They've got these great, beautiful leafage, but it's all immersed grown. Yeah. So the plants have got to convert. They're using all their energy to shift and change to adapt to their new environment. So they're not really absorbing as much as they can when they're adapted, and now they're just in the grow pattern all the time. So there's excess nutrients and might be excess light. Or we used one of those really nice aqua soils, and we use, like, say, ADA or something like that, and they leach a lot of stuff early. So when you first put them in there, they're really, really nutrient rich, and that some of that gets up into the water column. And if we don't water change enough to deal with that for the first few weeks, we can deal with a bunch of algae. So those are the most common things. What I would say is, if you are getting algae, first examine your light. If you have, try to figure out, are my plants pretty low demand, or are they all brand new? Dial that light down a little bit. If you have the ability to dim it, this is one of the biggest reasons why I preach really hard, like, find a light you can dim. Because cutting the hours is not usually as good as dimming the light.
Okay.
Cutting the hours can work. Don't get me wrong. If you got your light on for 8 hours and you cut it down to 4, that's a lot less light. Algae will struggle to do as well, and the plants can usually handle it.
Okay.
But if you dim that light by 50% of its current power and have it on the same period of time, especially in new tanks, those plants are more likely to convert and succeed, and that algae is going to struggle, because algae is a single cell organism, and it's fairly light hungry. Whereas plants are very complex organisms and very often can handle changes in their situation for longer term periods of time, where algae is so simple that it lives and dies based on those things in a very short window.
Yeah.
And also increase your water changes.
Yeah.
Like,
that's a good
point.
point.
Just in case there's too much of something in your water, like, test your water by all means. Test. If you're seeing way too much nitrates, water change, pull them out. Dilution is the solution. It's an age-old adage, goes all the way back to, like, the 50s.
Yeah.
I mean, you've got people who've been keeping fish for eternities where dilution is the solution. Dilute your water through a water change, help get some of that excess stuff out of the water, and that will help you fight that algae. And then finally, if you really need to, don't be afraid to, like, either rip all that algae out by hand to help inhibit it, if it's like your hair algae or your string algae. If it's surface algae, as long as your tank has cycled enough to be safe, don't be afraid to get a small algae crew in there. And it can start with something as simple as snails. Snails can handle a surprising amount of things, including way more ammonia than you'd ever think they should, that fish can't handle. But the snails will take it no problem. So don't be afraid to use some of the things that you might look at as a pest, like snails, because they are great in establishing an ecosystem. We're building an ecosystem in a planted tank. And there are lots of things in those ecosystems naturally, depending on where you are in the world, that we might not think about and we take for granted. And when we add those things into our system, they can give us lots of long-term success and health.
I like that. That'll be super helpful. I hope that's helpful for people listening. I think if you're just starting out, having algae, don't fear. Follow these steps we talked about. I think would be a good starting point to get rid of all that algae. And then the next biggest question we sort of get asked a lot is, my plants are melting back. What? Oh my God! I just bought them. I just got these beautiful plants, and they're all just dying. What do I do about plant melt, or how can I, make it a little easier?
So one of the biggest things that, the most common melts we kind of touched on a couple times is new plants converting. They're going from being grown submerged, which means that only really the roots were in water and everything else is up in the atmosphere. Right. It's exposed to the air. And the biggest thing to keep in mind here is that what that does for a plant is it exposes them to atmospheric CO2. Water really does not hold carbon dioxide very well. Whereas in our atmosphere currently, it's like 400, 450 parts per million CO2. Depending on where you are in the world, it can be even higher.
Right.
And that's a lot. Where, like, in water, the optimum CO2 for injected CO2 tanks is 30 parts per million. So less than a tenth of the amount that's in the atmosphere.
Right.
Right. In some cases, we're talking a 15th of what's in the atmosphere.
Yeah.
And that's optimal. So, of course, these plants are going to grow super lush, super robust, super fast when they're submerged and only the roots are in water grabbing their nutrients and everything else is exposed to the atmosphere, because there's less inhibiting them.
Right.
In the water, they can get so much less carbon. And more importantly, the leaf structure has to change. So leaves, when we look at them exposed to the air, we go look at our garden or whatever, they're opaque. You don't see through them. But a healthy aquarium plant has a faint translucence to most of their leaves, especially in stems. You can see ever so slightly through them. You can see almost like light passing through the leaf entirely.
Right.
It needs to change to that structure to survive and deal with the light through the water in order to photosynthesize correctly. So
Okay.
at first, it's going to melt. Almost all the plants you get, especially stems, will melt when you get them brand new, unless you happen to get them from some of the few retailers out there who take their time and do a lot of the conversion for you.
Yeah.
Most don't. They're getting them from a farm, and they're selling them straight to you. They've been in the tank for a few days. Maybe they just landed that day. Who knows, right? They shipped them in from whatever farm it is. You're going to have to do some of that work. Now, if we have an established tank and your plants start to melt, they start dying off, that's where we want to look up. And this is a very easy Google search. Just look up aquarium plant deficiency chart. And it's going to give you this beautiful graphic. There's like 6 or 7 different versions of it, but it'll show you pictures of different leaves and tell you what kind of nutrient deficiency you're running into. Most commonly, you're going to see like, my leaves are turning yellow. That means there's not enough nitrogen available. And if you were to test your water, you're probably going to see 0 nitrate. Well, without any nitrate, the most common food other than carbon that a plant needs is not present, and it can't grow, and it will die. You're starving the plant down. It'd just be like if you didn't give your fish food for a week. They're starving a little bit. Or you didn't feed yourself for 3 days. Your stomach would be screaming at you. You'd have a headache. You would not be feeling good because your body's telling you, I need some food, man.
I'm going to be hangry. I'm not going to last this day. You told me that. It's just not going to work out well for me. I'm eating a lot.
But the plants will tell you visually, are you starting to see holes in your leaves? Yeah. Well, that means it's missing this nutrient. Are your leaves starting to look kind of white or pale? That's this kind of problem. And that's where that chart is super helpful, because you can just look at this chart, look at your leaves, look at the chart, look at your leaves, and go, oh, that's my problem. I need a dose. Most commonly, if your plants are melting, do a water test. Test your water. It's your best friend. Test your water. And if you see 0 nitrates, there's not enough nutrients in the water. You better dose some fertilizer. Just little things like that go a long way. And there's all sorts of telltale signs that will help you. Another example would be like, I'm seeing only the bottom of my plants melt. My stems are getting really tall in my big tall tank. I've got a 55 gallon or I've got a 125. My stems are reaching the water surface, but the bottom half of the stems are just melting away. They're just a bare stem. That's because there's not enough light getting down. Your light's not strong enough to penetrate through all that excess foliage up top and provide the light necessary to keep the foliage down low healthy. If the foliage down low can't photosynthesize, the plant will shed that foliage for the foliage that's actually doing the work and helping itself.
Okay.
And often the way that we fix that is we just trim, we remove all the dead stuff down below, and we replant those stems. And if we can't increase our light, we're just going to pay more attention when we sit there and do our maintenance. If we start getting those plants too tall, we're going to trim them and replant and probably get rid of the old stems. And that can be a little labor intensive, yes.
Yeah.
But long term, your tank's going to look a little better. Your plants are going to stay healthier, and you're less likely to get that point where it's like, oh, I've got just all these kind of dead reeds looking in my soil, and I kept throwing away those good tops of the plants, expecting the new ones to keep growing out of the old stems, and then they just die out.
Yeah.
So there's a couple different ways that this happens. The big thing is test your water. First thing first, make sure that if you read some nitrates are in there, now consult that deficiency chart. Because that's going to tell you. It's one of the biggest tools I can teach people until they start to memorize those things naturally, or just learn oh, I see this problem in my leaf. Oops, I forgot to do this, or oops, I need to add a little bit more of this. And it can be the other way around. Is the other side of this is you've been growing, you've been fertilizing based on when you first planted the tank. And now you trimmed your stems several times, you've repropagated them. You went from having 6 or 7 stems when you started, and now you've got this dense forest in the back of your tank. But that dense forest isn't looking so good because there's not enough fertilizer for the significantly larger plant load that's in there. It's kind of like our fish, right? If you started with 5 fish and you fed them this teeny tiny pinch of food, and now you've had live bears or whatever, and you've got 500 fish, and you're feeding them this teeny tiny pinch of food, it's not enough food for all those fish. Same thing happens with our plants. As we get more and more plant load, we need a little bit more fertilizer to help make sure that all that extra plant load stays nice and healthy.
All right. So let's kind of break into our Yaka section, or I call it the Your Aquarium Questions Answered, where we answer some other questions people have had or we've seen, or somewhere some other questions have come up. So let's talk about the first one was, can you have a tank with just plants? And I think you touched on it.
Oh, most certainly. Most certainly. So, you can very easily do a tank with just plants. And I would argue, and I've said this before a long time ago. So I used to have a series called Plants for Profit. And that was during a time where I was not working ludicrous numbers of hours in my career. And I had a little bit more time. And I set up tanks on purpose where their design was not about fish. It was all about growing plants at as much optimum efficiency as I could. And yeah, definitely. You can take a tank, and I would argue like one of the best tanks for that is a 40 breeder or like a 75. Anything that's got that bigger footprint that gives you more room for plants. Okay. You can totally have a plants only tank. Most certainly. Now, one thing I will warn you when you try to do that plants only tank is, depending on where you get your plants from, you might get snails whether you wanted them or not. So if you're trying to do truly plants only, I would say master how to grow plants from tissue culture, because tissue culture will never have snails. Yeah. But if you buy like potted plants or something, you're probably just going to inevitably run into snails. But if you don't mind a little bit of snails and you're not feeding the snails really anything to actually feed on other than plant fertilizer, and you're not having too much dead plant matter, the snails will eventually die off and you won't have to deal with them anymore. That's good to know.
All right. And the next one is, do plants need a filter? Like an aquarium filter?
Yes and no.
Yeah.
So it doesn't necessarily hurt you to have a larger surface area for beneficial bacteria in a filter. What really does matter is actually having that water flow. So you could argue you could get away with just some power heads to move water around so that you're distributing your fertilizer or your CO2 if you're going with CO2, but you need some flow. You really need to be moving the water in some way, shape, or form, because just static water in the end is not going to be super healthy for your plants. And you probably run into issues with certain plants getting their nutrients when you're adding any of your like liquid fertilizer or whatever.
Right.
Now, if you were doing everything with a root tab and you only had root growing plants, in theory, you could get away with nothing and just like an air stone to have some water movement, but you don't want your water going completely stale and stagnant. That will lead to other issues inside the plants themselves. You need some movement just to make sure that the water doesn't go stagnant. Okay.
That's good. And then last one, for the plants that are going to need that big root structure, how long does it typically, because I would imagine most people are buying plants that are grown above the water. How long does it typically take for them to establish their roots?
So it really depends on, that basically comes down to, are you using CO2 or not? Okay. With CO2, you can get a root system established in 4 days, 5 days, a base start. Now, a really robust root system, a couple of weeks. It's just, they're going to have to grow those roots in, get that structure, and you can use certain nutrients. And there's products out there like Flourish Advance, for example, that are kind of blended specifically to not prohibit. That's the opposite of what you wanted to say, Bentley. Yeah. To produce faster root growth.
Gotcha.
Prohibit root growth. English is hard for everyone, folks.
Oh, I hear you.
So there are products specifically out there that are designed to help produce better roots, really boost, bolster, accelerate that root establishment process. The most common one, Flourish Advance, like I mentioned, but there's some others out there, and a lot of that just comes down to some of your micronutrients are really helpful in that. So like my personal favorite is Florin Multi from Brightwell. I absolutely love that product. And then beyond that, if you're doing no CO2, It kind of depends on each plant. So like your root feeders are going to establish their roots faster than say a stem plant, but a stem is going to still establish some amount.
Okay.
I would say anywhere between 1 and 3 weeks to get that starter to a robust root system.
Okay. Yeah, 1 to 3 weeks. That sounds good. Okay. Well, man, that's all the questions I got. That was
we did it,
man. That was great. Man, I had a good time. I learned a lot about plants, so I'm excited. So man, this is going to be a good one. I'm real excited for this one.
Thank you. Then I love babbling about plants, so
it was great. I thought it went really well. And let me ask you this: so for people, if they wanted to find your channel, find your content, what's the best place they could go? And obviously, I'll have it linked below. But is your YouTube the best place for that?
A majority of my stuff is YouTube. I do a little bit of stuff on Instagram, but most of that is just like whatever random pictures I take. You'll very frequently see pictures of my dog on there, or potentially both dogs that most frequently see their pictures. I have 3 dogs, and 2 of them are the ones that are the most frequent rascals that show up on my Instagram. But it's Instagram I don't use quite as much, and I've been using it less and less lately. But that's part of how Instagram's changing its whole model. YouTube definitely is just my name, Bentley Pascoe. Super simple. You can find me really, really easily. Of course, we'll have a link down below.
Okay.
but yeah, YouTube's where like all my fish content is for certain. YouTube is purely fish content.
All right. Well, I will definitely put that in the show notes for the video. And then, all right. Well, I appreciate it again, man. Thank you again for doing this. It's super cool.
Oh, dude, it's been a blast. I really hope that this helps some folks, or just exposes maybe people that didn't necessarily do planet tanks before. Maybe they'll give that a try. Give it a shot, because I really think, especially if you like smaller fish or some of your less like destructive fish, man, once you have a planet tank, it's hard to go back, because you get so many benefits and you get all this natural beauty. You get to bring nature into your home in an even more robust way. And just it's one of those things for a lot of us who maybe we've been cooped up during quarantine or something, and you're like, I would love some nature right now.
Yep.
Welcome to Planet Tanks, baby. You got nature right in your living room.
I like it. All right, man. Well, that sounds good. I guess we'll go ahead and end it. And thank everyone for listening. Appreciate it. Thanks again. And I'll see you guys next time. Take care.